"Walk the old man back to general seating. He's not on my list," Captain Darcy Havermeyer said to her aide, not lowering her voice, because there was no reason yet to think the old man could hear her, or that he mattered enough to warrant the trouble of lowering it. What is written in the canvas ledger Floyd Lathrop carries against his chest, the one he will not let a single member of her protocol staff so much as touch to check his name against a guest list, was a question nobody on that lawn had thought to ask yet, including her. If you have ever watched somebody dismiss the quietest person in the room, you already know how this ends. The morning had started 3 hours earlier and half a mile away in the gravel lot behind base housing, where Maddox Lathrop held the passenger door of his mother's sedan and waited for his grandfather to swing his legs out one at a time, the way he did everything now, in a fixed order that never varied. 16 years old and dressed in a borrowed tie he'd cinched too tight, Maddox had spent the drive over reciting, unprompted, the order of events printed on the ceremony program: the arrival of the reviewing party, the passing of the guidon, the remarks, the benediction. He knew it the way he knew batting averages. He wanted his grandfather to see that he'd done the reading. Floyd had said almost nothing the whole ride, one hand resting flat on the ledger in his lap, the canvas cover gone the color and softness of felt from years of exactly that grip. He was 81 years old, dressed in a suit cut in a year current uniform tailors wouldn't recognize, the lapels a full 2 inches wider than fashion allowed anymore, pressed that morning on a board set up in his own kitchen because he did not trust the drugstore cleaners with a crease. When Maddox had asked at breakfast whether he was excited, Floyd had said only that he supposed the coffee at these things was always burnt, which was as close as he came some mornings to admitting to feeling anything at all. Marrow Creek Army Garrison spread out ahead of them under a low autumn sky the color of dishwater, home to the 214th Engineer Support Battalion, its parade field mowed into stripes so precise they looked drawn with a straight edge. Rows of folding chairs faced a stage flanked by flags and a podium and a bronze object under a draped cloth that nobody had explained to Maddox yet, though he would come to know it well enough before the day was through. He had been the one to request the guest passes, filling out the form himself, listing his grandfather's name in block letters because he wanted, badly and simply, for people to see who he'd brought. Now, near the VIP line, Captain Havermeyer stood with a green binder open against her forearm, tabbed by the minute, and beside her an aide who had already begun to move toward Floyd with the practiced, unhurried authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Floyd did not step back. He turned his whole body toward the aide rather than his arm, because his right shoulder had not risen past a certain angle in 11 years, and turning the body was simply how he faced people now, a habit so old it no longer registered to him as compensation. The ledger stayed where it was, held flat against his sternum with both forearms, the way a man might carry something he intended to hand to no one. Maddox opened his mouth to object. Floyd, without looking at him, said only, "Let them do their job first," which was not surrender so much as an old soldier's patience with paperwork, the kind he'd spent 26 years learning never to fight until the paperwork proved itself wrong. The old suit did not fit him the way it had 30 years ago, loose now through the shoulders where muscle had gone, but he wore it the way he'd worn every uniform he'd ever been issued, pressed, correct, and entirely unconcerned with whether anyone noticed. What Maddox noticed, because he'd noticed it every Sunday of his life without understanding it, was the ledger itself, its canvas spine cracked white along the fold, its pages dense with penciled columns of numbers in a hand so small and even it looked machine-set. Every Sunday evening, after supper, Floyd took a fountain pen from a drawer nobody else was permitted to open, turned to a page near the back, and re-inked a single faded margin note, tracing over the same short line of figures until the graphite ghost beneath the ink disappeared. He had done this for as long as Maddox could remember. He had never once explained why, and Maddox had never once asked because there was something in the ritual's silence that made a question feel like trespass. Havermeyer's morning, up to that point, had been a genuine triumph, the kind she would have described flatly, if asked, as simply doing the job right. 2 visiting delegations, a congressional liaison's office, and a sister battalion honor detail from 3 states overdue, had arrived to discover their reserved rows overlapped by a printing error neither group would admit was theirs to solve. She had walked the length of the VIP section in under 4 minutes, cross-referencing name cards against her sheet. and rebuilt both seating blocks from scratch without a single visible ripple in the ceremony's start time, the congressional aide thanking her twice, and the honor detail's sergeant major nodding once, which from him was apparently rare. She kept her green binder because a green binder, unlike a phone or a laminated card, never lost its charge and never crashed, and in 11 change of command ceremonies, she had not misplaced a single guest. That record mattered to her the way another kind of officer might have cared about a marksmanship badge. It was in the flush of that small victory that she turned, scanning the last of the VIP line, and found Floyd Lathrop standing where the list said no one should be standing, holding an object that looked, to her practiced eye, less like a credential than like a man clutching a grocery ledger to a formal event. She checked the sheet twice, running a finger down the L's, and found a Lathrop entered only as guest of airman family. Maddox. General seating, Section C. No separate line for an 81-year-old man in an antique suit. No note explaining the canvas-bound object under his arm. "Sir," she said, not unkindly but without slowing down, "you're not on the VIP roster. Family seating is back through Section C, past the flagpole." She held up the sheet as if it were the argument itself. "That's not how the sheet reads." Maddox stepped half in front of his grandfather, chin up, voice cracking on the first word. "He was invited. I invited him. He's my grandfather." "I understand that, and I'm sure that's true," Havermeyer said, already turning to her aide, already assigning the problem a shape she recognized, an overeager relative, a seating mistake, 10 seconds of correction before it became someone else's 10 seconds. "Get him a chair at the field edge. Section C is filling. We don't have time to relitigate the guest list 20 minutes out." Floyd said nothing to that. He simply turned his whole body toward the folding chair the aide indicated, the ledger still flat against his chest, and walked toward it the way he walked toward everything now, unhurried, deliberate, arriving exactly once. The chair at the field's edge sat slightly crooked in the grass, and Floyd lowered himself into it in the same fixed sequence he used for every chair. A hand first to the armrest, weight shifted, the bad shoulder held still while the rest of him did the work around it. Maddox dragged a second chair beside him without being told to, close enough that their knees nearly touched, and neither of them spoke for a while, which suited Floyd fine. An aide named Airman Harlow Quimby had been assigned to walk the field edge section checking programs against a printed manifest, a task she performed with the mild boredom of someone 22 years old, doing exactly what she was told. She reached Floyd's row, glanced at his ledger out of habit more than suspicion, and stopped. The columns of figures were ruled in a hand she'd only ever seen in the base museum's glass cases, old drafting lettering, uniform and small, the kind taught before anyone used a machine to do it for them. "That's real drafting hand," she said, half to herself, and Floyd, without looking up, said only, "It was once," which told her nothing and everything at the same time. When Havermeyer asked him, a few minutes later, and mostly out of procedural thoroughness, whether he had any other identification besides the guest slip his grandson had printed, Floyd answered in 4 words. "Discharge papers are home." When she asked, with the faint edge of someone repeating herself, why he needed to bring a notebook to a ceremony, he said, "It's not a notebook," and did not elaborate, and something about the flatness of the correction. Not defensive, not proud, simply accurate. Made her write a small mark in her binder margin rather than argue further. Sergeant Callie Ogle, the honor guard NCO responsible that morning for the color detail, passed close enough during a formation check to glance down at the ledger's open page and stopped mid-step in a way that made the airman behind her nearly collide with her back. Stamped faintly in the corner of one page, half worn from handling, was a small circular mark she recognized because she had cataloged one exactly like it 3 years earlier in the Base Museum archive, on an Engineering Corps authentication stamp retired from service decades before she'd enlisted. She said nothing to Floyd. She filed it, the way she filed everything, for later. Up on the stage, the outgoing commander had begun the traditional reading of the battalion's unit history, a passage reprinted, essentially unchanged, in every ceremony program for over 3 decades. He read through the founding years, the campaign streamers, and arrived, as the passage always did, at the story of a river-crossing exercise 34 years past, when a pontoon bridge rated for a lighter load than the crossing required had been recalculated under field conditions by, the program stated, a decorated engineering officer whose name Floyd had heard read aloud at 11 prior ceremonies without once correcting it. Floyd's hand went still on the ledger's cover, not trembling, merely still, in the specific way of a man listening to a sentence he has rehearsed, disagreeing with silently for years. The load figures cited in the reading matched, number for number, a column 3 pages into his ledger in his own hand, dated in pencil beneath a private tolerance mark no printed program had ever carried. Maddox, watching his grandfather's face rather than the stage, saw nothing dramatic happen there at all, which was itself the strangest thing he'd seen all morning. The guidon passed hands at 11:40, the outgoing commander presenting the folded battalion colors to Colonel Bertram Rainey, 58 years old, freshly arrived to take command of the installation his own career had once been shaped inside. Rainey received the guidon with the correct formality, held it the correct number of seconds, and then, instead of turning to address the assembled ranks as the program specified, stood motionless for a moment that stretched a half-beat too long for anyone on the reviewing stand to read as intentional. Then he stepped down off the stage. He did not go toward the flag officers waiting to shake his hand in the receiving line, did not go toward the outgoing commander who still stood mid-gesture beside him, did not go toward the podium microphone at all. He walked instead in a straight line across the entire width of the parade field, guidon still in hand, boots cutting a dark path through grass gone silver with morning dew, toward the folding chairs at the field's edge where an old man in a suit 30 years out of cut sat with a canvas ledger against his chest. The field went quiet in stages, the way a large crowd does when it senses something before it understands it. Conversation dying first at the front rows, then rippling backward until even the wind seemed to hold. Havermeyer, who had been crouched at that exact moment beside the field edge section, adjusting a folding chair meant originally for a congressional aide, froze with one hand still on its cold aluminum frame, unable to finish the small correcting motion she'd begun, because the man she was in the middle of quietly reseating was the man the incoming commander of the entire installation was now walking toward, with his hand rising to his brow. Colonel Rainey stopped in front of Floyd Lathrop and saluted him first, before the flag officers, before his own predecessor, before a single word had been spoken to explain why. Floyd stood, turning his whole body up out of the chair in the same fixed order he used for every rising, and returned the salute with a hand that did not shake, though the shoulder beneath it would not lift past its old, permanent angle. Nobody moved. Somewhere behind them, a program rustled and stilled. "Sir," Rainey said, and stopped there, because whatever he had rehearsed in the half-second walk across that lawn had apparently left him the moment he arrived. Havermeyer straightened up slowly from the folding chair, her hand still hovering an inch from its frame, watching the exact scene her run sheet had no line for. Rainey lowered his hand. He did not explain himself to the crowd, not yet, not in the way a lesser man might have turned the moment into a speech. He looked instead at the ledger against Floyd's chest, and something crossed his face that read, to anyone close enough to see it, less like recognition than like relief, 34 years overdue. "You still carry it," he said quietly, to Floyd alone, though half the field heard him anyway. Floyd's answer was 3 words, offered the way he offered everything, without ornament. Never stopped needing it. Around them, the chorus held its collective breath in its own private ways. Airman Quimby had gone rigid mid-step, program still open in her hand to the page she'd been about to read from. Sergeant Ogle's jaw had set hard, the way it did when a suspicion she'd been sitting on quietly proved itself true. And Maddox Lathrop sat perfectly still in his folding chair, 16 years old, watching the base commander salute his grandfather, and understood for the first time in his life that there was a version of Floyd Lathrop he had never once been introduced to. Rainey turned then, finally, to address the field, though he kept one hand resting lightly on Floyd's shoulder, the good one, as he spoke, and his voice, pitched for a crowd he'd addressed 100 times in his career, had gone unmistakably rougher at the edges. 34 years ago, he said, I was a lieutenant leading a company across a river on a pontoon bridge that was rated for a load it was never going to hold. This man recalculated that rating under field conditions, on paper, with a slide rule, while my company was already staged to cross. I would not be standing on this field. Most of the men behind me at the time would not be standing anywhere. He paused, and in the pause, the only sound was wind moving once through the flags. His name is not on the history we just read. The field did not erupt into applause, not yet. The moment was too strange, too raw for that. But a low murmur passed through the folding chairs like current finding ground, and Havermeyer felt the full weight of it land somewhere behind her sternum, because she was the one who had ordered the man now being saluted by a full colonel to be moved to a folding chair meant for someone else's aid. The unit history's printed page, still open on the podium where the outgoing commander had left it mid-sentence, credited the pontoon recalculation to a decorated officer named on the plaque scheduled to be unveiled at the reception in 90 minutes, a name the entire garrison had repeated at 11 prior ceremonies without a flicker of doubt. Rainey's restrained account, offered in a dozen careful sentences and no more, filled in the shape of what had happened on that river 3 decades ago, but it did not correct the page still sitting open under the podium light, and it did not uncast the bronze already cooling in a foundry mold 20 miles away. Havermeyer reached the reviewing stand at a near-run, program in hand, and found the historian's liaison line busy, and then, when it finally connected, found herself speaking to a recorded message informing her that the base historian's office, run in absentia that week by a contracted retiree named Foster Cadwallader, would not process same-day archive requests without his personal authorization, which he was, the message stated with maddening cheer, currently unavailable to provide. She called the foundry next. The plaque, she was told, had already been poured that morning, per the print order submitted 3 weeks prior, under the name that had stood uncorrected in every reprint of the battalion's history since before she was commissioned. Mounting was still scheduled for the reception. 90 minutes. Havermeyer stood very still on the edge of the stage, program in one hand, phone in the other, and looked once across the field at Floyd Lathrop, still seated in his crooked folding chair, ledger back against his chest, apparently unbothered by the small catastrophe now radiating outward from her clipped-together sheet. "That's not how the sheet reads," she said, to no one, and for the first time all morning meant it as something closer to a confession than a policy. She left the reviewing stand at a pace just short of running, cutting through a side door of the headquarters building toward the records annex, a low brick room that smelled of dust and cold paper and had not, she would guess later, been properly aired out since before she'd enlisted. She told herself she was going there to disprove the old man, to find some clerical footnote that would settle the confusion cleanly, put the ceremony back on schedule, and let her greet the reception in exactly the state her run sheet promised. She did not admit, even to herself, how much of that certainty was already cracking. The 1991 boxes were exactly where the annex's hand-lettered index said they would be, third shelf, unlabeled beyond a date range scrawled in marker, and it took her 20 minutes of kneeling on a cold floor in her dress uniform to find the folder she wanted, an original engineering requisition form, carbon-copied, listing the emergency load recalculation for the river crossing bridge, and signed, in a small, even drafting hand she now recognized without needing to be told, by a specialist F. Lathrop. Beneath it, clipped and yellowed, was a second document she had not gone looking for at all. A memorandum, 3 paragraphs, addressed from the battalion's engineering office to the historian's desk, requesting that public credit for the redesign be attributed instead to a senior officer whose name would, the memo noted with bureaucratic delicacy, better reflect favorably on the program's budget performance for that fiscal year. It was signed by a young records officer named Foster Cadwallader, 34 years younger than the man currently refusing her calls. Havermeyer sat back on her heels on the cold floor of the annex, both documents in her hands, and understood with a kind of nausea that every reprinted program she had personally proofread and approved for 11 ceremonies had carried that same substitution forward without her ever once questioning it, because questioning it had never once occurred to her as part of the job. She had not committed the wrong. She had only ever, faithfully and competently, kept it alive. Floyd Lathrop gave his account of that day in 11 sentences, standing near the podium an hour before the reception was due to begin, Colonel Rainey beside him and Havermeyer, holding both recovered documents against her chest the way Floyd himself had held his ledger all morning. He did not raise his voice. He did not, at any point, ask that his name replace the one already cast in bronze, though everyone in the small gathered circle understood by then that it would. "The bridge was rated for a lighter vehicle class than what was crossing," he said. "I caught the discrepancy in the manifest weights 2 hours before the company staged. Recalculated the safe load myself, on the bank, with what I had. Lieutenant Rainey held the crossing until I finished. That's the whole of it." He paused and turned his whole body slightly toward Cadwallader's memo, which Havermeyer still held. "Man who wrote that letter wasn't wrong that the budget review would have gone hard on the program that year. He was only wrong about what to do with that information." Havermeyer looked down at the memo in her hands, then up at Floyd, and something in her posture, the practiced, upright carriage of 11 flawless ceremonies, loosened for just a moment into something closer to a woman standing in a field holding evidence of a mistake she had spent a career unknowingly protecting. "I have never once questioned that page," she said. "Not once. I proofed it 11 times. "Most people don't question the page," Floyd said. "It's printed. Printed things carry their own kind of authority, whether they earned it or not." It was as close as he came that whole day to offering her absolution. She did not wait for the reception to begin. She left the gathering at a walk that became a near run again, this time carrying the corrected requisition paperwork herself rather than delegating it, driving the 20 miles to the foundry in her own car, still in dress uniform, and stood over the caster's shoulder while he reset the mold's lettering plate by hand, watching 2 hours disappear from the flawless schedule she had built her professional pride around, and finding, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not mourn the 2 hours at all. Maddox watched all of this from the field's edge, ledgerless himself but close enough to his grandfather to catch fragments. A river, a recalculation, a name 34 years buried. And it was somewhere in the space between Rainey's account and Havermeyer's confession that he finally understood what he was looking at every Sunday evening at the kitchen table. He asked his grandfather quietly while the small crowd dispersed toward the reception tents, why he re-inked that one line every week and no others. Floyd looked at the ledger a long moment before answering, the way he looked at everything before committing to a sentence. "That page isn't the bridge," he said. "That's the day I met your grandmother. Wrote it down the only way I knew how to write anything down, in load figures and tolerance marks, because that was the language I trusted not to fade on me." He ran a thumb once along the ledger's spine. "I keep the ledger current for load ratings nobody's going to ask me about again in this lifetime. Come Sunday, I ink that one line so it doesn't go the way everything else does." He did not need to finish the sentence. Maddox understood, watching him, that re-inking that faded margin was also how his grandfather kept talking to her, 11 years on, in the only shorthand the two of them had ever needed. The plaque was remounted before the reception's first toast, quietly, with no announcement and no second ceremony. A maintenance crew and Havermeyer herself holding the bracket level, while a young sergeant drove the final screw, the new lettering catching the afternoon light for the first time under a bronze surface still faintly warm from its second casting. "Floyd Lathrop, Specialist, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers," it read now, beneath the same load figures that had stood correct in his ledger for 34 years without an audience. Colonel Rainey found him afterward near the edge of the reception tent, away from the noise, and asked for nothing beyond what he'd already been given that morning. No further statement, no interview for the base paper, no speech at next year's ceremony. "Just come back," Rainey said. "Every year if you're willing. Sit wherever you like." Floyd said he supposed he could manage that, which from him counted as a promise. Havermeyer, passing with an empty folding chair under one arm, met Floyd's eyes for a moment and said nothing at all, which by then had become its own form of correction. Months later, on a Sunday evening with the porch light off because the day's last light hadn't yet failed, Floyd sat on the front steps of his own house with the ledger open on his knee, fountain pen in hand, tracing the same faded margin line he had traced every week for 11 years, the pencil ghost beneath it long since worn invisible under layers of returning ink. Maddox sat one step below him, the corrected unit history spread open across his own knees, and read the new paragraph aloud without being asked to, his voice steady over the sentence that named his grandfather, where, for 34 years, it hadn't. Somewhere on a shelf, in a drawer, in somebody's coat pocket, there is a name still waiting to be read correctly. Floyd closed the ledger when Maddox finished, resting one hand flat on its worn canvas cover, and said nothing else because there was nothing left in that particular margin that still needed saying out loud.